Hello and welcome. My name is Carol Carter, and I'm the founder and CEO of Global Minded. We are all about creating a capable, diverse talent pipeline to get more women, people of color, ability status, LGBTQIA, any way you can define diversity into the education, economic mobility, and leadership pipeline. And we do that through a number of different programs, one of which is an annual conference. It's been virtual the last 2 years, but this year, June 22nd, 23rd, 24th, 2022, we will be live in Denver and looking forward to seeing all of you, not on little tiny tiles as we've been in the last couple of years. So that's one of our programs. Also monthly, we offer these equity sessions led by leaders of color with primarily panelists who are diverse from all different backgrounds. And those are all on our YouTube channel so that you can also watch those in your own time. Tomorrow, we have a special event with Amazon Web Services. We're launching a diverse board bound series. So that'll be the first in a number of series that are going to be happening over the next year. And you can sign up for that through our newsletter or directly through the Global Minded website. So it is my pleasure to introduce today's panel, and we're kind of, like I say, we're in these live and interesting times. And so I know Dr. Pierre Theodore is joining us, but we're going to get started with some introductions as we await him. And first, I just want to share, why is this time so critical for mental health? I mean, actually, I don't think I need to share with anybody why the time is so critical for mental health, but we know, especially for the populations that Global Minded serves, that COVID-19 has had a really, really tough impact on mental health, and it has hurt the people who are least resourced, those who are the most vulnerable, marginalized, many of these people who have lost family members and have been sick themselves. So that has commingled with a lot of other stressors, including housing issues, transportation, job issues. And we've assembled these incredible panelists today to look at how we can make our way in a very sturdy and positive way out of such a difficult setback, really, COVID caused the last couple of years, in addition to racial unrest, a lot of other things that have revealed themselves at the same time. So I'd like to just start by having each person introduce themselves and share why this topic is, not only what you do professionally, but why is this topic so important to you? And then we'll get into some of our questions for the panelists. And why don't we start out with Ron, and then we'll go to Liz, and then Gurchaten, and then Josh.
Thank you, Carol, and thank you everyone for joining today. My name is Ron Lessard. I'm Mohawk. I am the acting executive director for the White House Initiative on American Indian and Alaska Native Education. I also serve on the White House Council on Native Affairs and serve on the Commission for Native Children. So this is a real pleasure for me to be with you today. And this is something very close and very dear and near to me, working with Native children, working with our students who have a history of so many different things. And one of those things is resilience in coming through COVID as they have. A lot of our students haven't been set up in a way to attend school virtually. So there have been a lot of barriers and challenges, but I know through the education system and through our history and traditions and our values that they will, come out the other side doing very well and have successful lives. Thank you.
Go ahead, Liz.
Thank you so much. And Ron, I appreciate that. I want to acknowledge you and pay my respects to the Akokisa people on whose land I sit. They are the traditional custodians of this land here in and around what is now Houston. And I wish to extend and pay my respects to their elders and to the wisdom of the people who guided this land for many years. My name is Liz Swiger. I am a partner at PricewaterhouseCoopers. I have a PhD in organizational leadership psychology, but most importantly, I'm someone who lives with major depressive disorder, and I live with OCD. I live with obsessive compulsive disorder. And my journey and my experience with my own mental health has made me very passionate about advocating not only for mental health as health, but for ensuring that we are able to meet people where they are, particularly in the workplace. And so I have the incredible privilege and opportunity to also be on the board and lead strategic planning for Genesis Works Houston, a nonprofit organization that provides job, technical, life skills training for students from schools that have been historically excluded from the resources that they should have to prepare young people today. And as we work through that, one of the things, and Carol, you brought this up in your introduction, COVID has been such a hardship for so many of our young people, and having been taken out of their regular school environments and the challenges that it's placed on their families and the mental health impact of that as they now these young people graduate from high school and start to enter the workforce, go into continuing, higher education. And so for me, this is not just an issue of mental health or even health equity. This is a question of how we confront systemic issues in our society and how we bring about justice. So I am very excited to be with you today, and I'm just in awe of this incredible panel that you've assembled. So thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, Liz. Gurchaten, go ahead.
No, thank you very much, Carol. And wow, what a great bunch of people to follow. My name is Gurchaten, or Nanu to people who, to friends and colleagues. My pronouns are he, him, they, them. I'm a program officer working for the International Labour Organization based here in Geneva, Switzerland. The topics I cover are particularly non-discrimination and equal pay for work of equal value. I'm also very fortunate to serve as the president of UN Globe, which is the group that represents LGBTIQ+ personnel and dependents in the United Nations system. In addition to that, I'm also a board advisor and advisor on We Create Space, a mental health platform, or a platform for queer leadership and empowerment and self-care. Why is it important for me here today? As a queer person of color and faith, and of a working class background and a first generation background myself, the issues of mental health were very, very pivotal in my life. Often overlooked them, often neglected them, and sort of pushed them aside, I would dare to say. And it wasn't until, until I was 2013, I believe, when I first embarked on my first journey into mental health and actually seeking help to appreciate who I am and better understand who I am, rather than hide those facets of me that make me and that allow me to stand in the fullness of myself. Ever since then, I've actually valued the importance of health, having good mental health, and the resources that are available. So a big shout out and big appreciation for all mental health care facilitators, practitioners who are providing an invaluable service to key communities, to marginalized populations, to vulnerable groups, to minority groups. And I think it's with then that I realized that, without key mental health, how can you actually be a leader to others and a role model to others? And I think it's integral that, as a leader myself of a group, of a specific vulnerable group or minority group, that I model those behaviors and talk about how we must, how mental health is important to all of us. So thank you again for inviting me, and I look forward to the conversation throughout the course of the next hour.
Thank you so much, Gurchaten. Josh, welcome. And then Pierre, we're excited to introduce you as well. So go ahead, Josh, and we'll get to Pierre.
Thank you, Carol. Well, I'm a straight white male, and I've been working in the area of the social determinants of health for about a decade now. And when I spoke to my firm about my kind of visible leadership of some of that work, I asked the firm, do we want a straight white male person to be leading this initiative? And I got a pretty emphatic yes. I lead our healthcare strategy practice. So I consult to boards and CEOs and management teams. And what my bosses said to me was, you'll be able to be heard in a way that many others won't. You've got access to these C-suites. And if you're talking about it as a strategic issue, maybe it'll get attention. So that's what I've been trying to do. The firm has made a series of investments, especially since this year, since the murder of George Floyd, in establishing a Deloitte Health Equity Institute. We've got a large and growing practice that's really trying to encourage our clients, the large health systems and the health insurers, to really compete with each other in a very different way. Since the first day that I began in healthcare, my wife is a pediatrician, so I saw firsthand the kind of suffering that our American medical students go through to become a doctor. And I was at her white coat ceremony and saw these young doctors all take the Hippocratic Oath. And I have always been shocked that our, at least American healthcare industry, doesn't compete on the basis of creating health. It really competes on the basis of treating sickness. And it always seemed strategically crazy. So I think we have a time now where there's an added moral imperative around health equity to really change the way these big companies invest and work. And my goal is to get these companies embedding health equity imperatives and health equity accountability built into all layers of the organization, from their ESG and board level commitments right down to their operations, and removing things like racial bias in a lot of their predictive algorithms. It goes right down to the IT. And so I think I'm on this panel sort of representing, hopefully, a change in business direction and really bringing equity right into the heart of the healthcare industry in this country.
Thank you so much, Josh. And this is Dr. Pierre Theodore, who along with Dr. Monique Butler leads our different health equity events every month on a lot of different topics. So Pierre, welcome. And you want to say a few words about yourself and your background?
Absolutely, Carol, and please forgive me to all for being a little bit late today. I was having some technical trouble, so I do apologize for that. And absolutely delighted to be here, and already thrilled by some of the sharing that's occurred during this discussion, and look forward very much to our panel discussion today. And just give you a little bit of background about myself. I'm a Vice President of Global Public Health at Johnson & Johnson, and I take responsibility for issues around health equity, social determinants of health in our global public health organization. So focusing on largely infectious disease, but also surgical disease in sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia. In addition to that, I've participated with J&J over the course of the last 2 years on its effort that we are calling our Race to Health Equity, which is an integrated effort across the enterprise to address health inequities primarily in the United States to begin, but really as a global project based on understanding some of the important social determinants of health. And importantly, what kind of levers can a large pharmaceutical company like J&J pull in this domain? By way of background, I'm a clinician first and foremost. I'm trained as a cardiothoracic surgeon. I'm actually still on the faculty of cardiac surgery at Stanford University. And one of the observations is that often we tend to separate out mental health from what you might call bodily health in some ways as though they are sort of distinct specialties that address the issues. But what you see, if you look with any degree of detail, is that there is, of course, a very close liaison between mental health and general health and well-being. And what you find, whether it's looking from the perspective of a clinician who's trying to ensure compliance with medical therapy or ongoing follow-up, or from the perspective of insurer who wants to make sure that costs are well maintained, or most importantly, when one considers from the perspective of the patient, there is this close interface between psychological well-being and general well-being. One specific example might be the general observation that the costs of managing things like congestive heart failure or diabetes tend to be considerably higher in patients that are suffering from major psychiatric conditions. And so it just gives me a sense, and it reminds me continuously that there is no division, of course, between mind and body, either conceptually or in terms of healthcare. I'm delighted to be with you today and discuss a little bit more of our perspectives at J&J. And again, I'm very excited about the conversation.
Awesome. And before, Pierre, we start to go into the questions, I just want to mention why this is so important to me personally. I am the fifth of 5 kids, and my dad had major mental illness between the time when I was 3rd and 5th grade, and had 3 nervous breakdowns, wound up in the VA hospital. We didn't have any health, no health care for that type of thing. And so really resulting had major financial crisis. And thanks to my mom, she was very much able to, over the next few years, help stabilize our family and him, and get him launched in a different career that she then joined. And so this is just really very personal to me, because I think that mental health needs, it needs the way Betty Ford came out for alcoholism, like it needs a person who is able to take the shame away from these things that people do not ask for, and yet they suffer in silence with a lot of this. And I'm hoping that some of the work and what comes out of today is a way to really bring that light of humanity to be really real, allow all of us to be real, and to be in organizations that can be a lot more real and humane with people who have mental issues. So I'll just stop there and let you all go. If I don't know, Pierre, if we want to go to the first question, but and tell me if I have it here if you need it, because I know you're coming off of tech issues.
Why don't you go ahead and I have a couple of, why don't you kick us off with the first question, Celeste?
Sure.
And then I have a couple of others that I want to follow up on. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so how can educators, business people, and students promote health and well-being? So these are sort of these pipeline audiences that we serve. And why don't we, maybe we can just go in the same order as we did the introductions. Maybe start with Ron, then go to Liz, Gurchaten,
Yes.
Josh.
Would you repeat the question again, please?
Yep. The question is, how can educators, business people, and students themselves really promote health and well-being? What are some of the specific things people can do along this pipeline of the audiences that we serve?
Well, I think first of all, one has to lead by example. So in our communities, living traditional ways, taking part in ceremonies. I'm a sun dancer. I've been a sun dancer for over 25 years. My mom was in the boarding school system. But one of the things that is important is that we're being tested when we have values that come with our teachings, but we have to put them to practice. And sometimes, when you're like, as an educator, when you have a class and you teach a certain subject, at some point you're tested, you have to take that test. This COVID is a test. It is an opportunity for our young people to address it in a way and bring all those things that they've learned into themselves, to address it. And what I mean by that is, you have to build a relationship with everything, and that's where I'm coming from. So you have to build a relationship with COVID. You have to build a relationship with mental health, and with one of the things, and I really appreciated the doctors mentioning about Johnson & Johnson. One of the things that's important to me in traditional healing of the healers that I know is that making a relationship with whatever that is healing you. If it's aspirin, where does that come from? What is the relationship? Our people are used to, in a traditional way, understanding healing properties as plants, as herbs. They know where they come from. They make a relationship with that. So I think what's very important is, as an educator, is to take young people to embrace those that have embraced their culture. And it doesn't matter if you're from a native culture or where you're from, but the values that come with that, practice that in a way. So use every opportunity. We can look at COVID as a very terrible thing, and on the surface it is, but also it's, our people have been historically resilient, whatever it is. So this is one more thing that's come our way, and we have to teach our young people to, there's no magic in taking care of this, COVID or anything else. It's bringing about all those lessons you've learned and applying them so that you can be a healthy person, and then a healthy person and a mentally healthy person, so that you can be there for your family and yourself and your elders. And so I think that's an important aspect of what we teach, not only from the Western standpoint, but how traditional medicine embraces people, of who they are and where they come from, and how do you bring those practices from your ceremonies and that into your actual daily living.
Thank you, Ron. Liz.
Well, thank you. And Ron, just reflecting on what you said, a key word that comes out for me is relationship.
Yes.
And what the thread that I sort of draw from that is that when we think about relationships permeate all human existence, the basis of social interaction, right? Social exchange, which interestingly, one word that I have found in business, particularly in our workplaces, that tends to be demonized is the word transactional.
Yeah.
Transactional is still a form of relationship. And this is why I think that's important. The basis of human interaction is social exchange. I do something, and then you're either inspired or compelled to do something else, whether it's in return to me or whether it's something that you then pass on. I think that as we entered this world post-COVID, where now we've learned a lot more than we ever knew before about how to form relationships outside of physical presence. How do we start to build these connections? How do we have relationships now that are authentic, that are genuine, where we are cultivating empathy, which can be learned? I think that from my perspective in the workplace, relationship is the key. Now, whether it is the relationship between the employer and the employee, which has a contractual element to it, there is a very distinct transactional element to it. That doesn't mean it has to be negative. How do we find ways of being in relationship with one another, where we are providing the support, we are providing the benefits, we are fitting our benefit products, if you will, to the need that is there with our people? How are we meeting people where they are? How are we listening to what people tell us they need, as opposed to a leadership model that comes in and says, oh, I know, I'm going to provide, what we provide you is what you need. How do we enter into relationship with one another? How do we cultivate relationships between colleagues? How do we help to strengthen, establish, continue authentic human connection when we are now in these very dispersed working environments that aren't going to change? There will be a different version than what we've had during the most restrictive of the COVID lockdown, but the future looks different. And so from my perspective, as I look to how do I be a good advocate in the workplace for others like me who have experienced challenges with our mental health, it comes down to a question of how do we foster the right relationships where we are helping people to form meaningful connections and also providing the benefits, the resources, the access that are so necessary. So I think you hit the nail on the head. It's about relationship, your relationship to yourself, to your environment, and to those around you.
Thank you, Liz. Gurchaten, go ahead.
I think just going to build on what Ron and Liz were saying. That I think what Ron said was relationship. The second part, what Liz said was self. Indeed, it is about the relationship you have with yourself. I think the key thing is what we realize when we're growing up is a lot of the time the narrative that we're telling ourselves, the inner voice, how we speak to ourselves is very, 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 very important here. I think that's very, very important to pick up, that having good mental health starts with yourself and recognizing that you're part of this process, and it's not something that actually is going to it's not something that actually is going to come to you. You're going to have to take part of that journey. But I think part of that, you mentioned it was schools, teachers, educators, and workplaces. I think the other part is home. And sometimes, in particular for Indigenous communities, diaspora communities, first-gen communities, it's very difficult to even have those discussions. Particularly, for myself, and during growing up in that time, in a specific time when mental health was not even talked about, and even still to this day, it's not talked about. And you see high rates of suicide in communities of color, and you see that the impact of COVID has been very, very acute, in particular to diaspora and communities of color. So I think one of the key things there is ensuring that that services are available and those conversations are also happening at home. Sadly, that wasn't always the case for me, and therefore schools are very, very important. And this is something that teachers can always ensure that a safe and learning environment is provided for. We actually see in cases, and studies have actually shown that in situations of violence or harassment, in terms of homophobia, biphobia, transphobia, has an impact on LGBTIQ plus youth in schools, not just at the time of studying in the school, but that homophobia, biphobia, transphobia, that stigma and discrimination lives on to impact their careers, their pay grades, their career growth, their personal lives as well in the future. So I think in schools it's very, very, very important to ensure a safe and learning environment for all. And then I think when it comes to, how much of a burden can educators have? Is it their responsibility? Ensuring discipline, ensuring providing lessons. Do schools have access, and do students have access to trained professional healthcare providers who can actually also provide them with tailor-made care that suits their needs? Often we come to this sort of one-size-fits-all approach, and that does not work. The one-size-fits-all approach stems from one particular model instead of it's a model suited for a majority rather than a minority, and therefore we need to rethink the situation, or redesign the system rather from a sort of majority perspective to a minority perspective, and making sure it's more and more inclusive. And then when it comes to workplaces, I think those conversations are very, very critical to ensure that, myself, I had a health incident, at work, and a colleague said, "Oh, I better not give you that. You'll just get stressed out." And I think conversations like that perpetuate the stigma of living with mental health issues within the workplace. So we know we have to be very, very careful. One, training people on how to be more sensitive to mental health, people living with mental health, recognizing your own mental health in the workplace as well, having the relevant resources in terms, and that doesn't include just having people to talk to, but that also includes having the relevant time to actually visit and take time out to see a mental health care practitioner. I was very fortunate when in my scenario, I was able to talk to my boss and say, well, I need to go to my counseling session now. Thank you very much. I need to leave work early today. And having that sort of support as well. So I think that's very, very vital in a workplace. So I think that's very, very, very key. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Gurchaten. Josh.
Well, Carol, as I said in the beginning, my perspective on this is mainly working with large corporations and large employers. And one of the changes that I'm seeing that I'm most excited about is a lot of very serious places are starting to draw a very clear parallel between the climate movement and, for lack of a better term, the health movement, which includes physical and mental health. And I can imagine a time relatively soon where companies start to measure their health footprint just the same way large industrials measure their carbon footprint. Literally asking the question, are my actions as a large corporation creating health in the world or destroying health in the world? One of a clients we're working with has kind of broken this down into 4 circles of action. So first is within your enterprise, really thinking about your employees and really knowing where they are. There's a lot of data that isn't collected. We just heard some really poignant examples of companies that support their people and those that don't, from social determinants to behavioral health issues, getting your own house in order. And Ron, you mentioned leading by example. I almost think there's not much you can do until you get your own house in order. The second would be in your products and services. So are my products and services causing mental health issues? Are they helping my customers manage and have happier lives? Are they creating physical ill health or positive health? The third is in the community and the environment. So what kind of a neighbor am I? Am I polluting neighborhoods? Or am I being a good steward of land where I operate? And then the fourth circle of action is within my ecosystem. What am I taking a stand on in my industry? What am I cajoling my competitors to do? What am I doing in my contracting and my supply chain? Really driving the idea of generating health all the way down through all the resources that I can control. So I'm seeing a lot of movement on this, and I'm optimistic that we can really move into a world where big organizations are measuring themselves in terms of their health footprint and remediating where they're having a negative impact and starting to compete with each other in the same way that we see the incredible innovation now happening around electric vehicles. Why can't we have that same level of investment from the investor community, from corporate resources, to new ways to close health gaps around the world?
Thank you so much, Josh. And Pierre, and then I'm going to make a little comment after that.
No, absolutely. First of all, I'm really struck by the thoughtfulness of the responses thus far. I think that a couple of themes that have come up is trying to address this issue of stigma and mental health specifically. And I think from a workplace environment, as we sort of move into modes where items like a mental health day, or actually saying out loud in a meeting, look, I'm trying to preserve my energy by not taking on this responsibility, and actually making direct reference to one's own mental health so that it really becomes a sort of accepted part of how we protect ourselves and maintain our resiliency. And I realize in a corporate setting that can be a real challenge, right? Because we have this sort of history and an expectation of a certain willingness to ignore the challenges of mental health. And at the same time, I think what's incumbent upon leaders in particular is to speak directly to the importance of taking time off, of vacation, of admitting when you're having weaknesses and where you need help. And I think this has been mentioned a couple of times, is a form of modeling. Because in some way, we all look to our mentors for the sign that it's okay to express that we're not feeling okay. And I can say through much of from a personal standpoint, to bring it home to myself, and much of the time that I trained in surgery, any sort of pronouncement of weakness or struggle was essentially completely disallowed. And I think what you could see around the community of surgeons was kind of a general malaise, because there just wasn't this recognition that sometimes you need help. So I'm really clued into this notion that several of you have brought up about stigmatization first and foremost, and how we overcome that in the workplace. But more broadly, I think someone put it in the chat, we create a vocabulary around our mental challenges, if you will, so that in a way, the idea of taking care of ourselves from a mental health and a behavioral health standpoint is normalized in the same way that, of course, our physiological challenges are normalized if we have a twisted ankle or we've developed a flu or something of that sort. So to me, these sort of trying to create that sort of vocabulary, that space to acknowledge when we're struggling is an important part of making a world in which we both acknowledge mental health and mental health challenges, but also can be present to support one another when they arise.
I agree. And I think one of the things that we often don't talk about, it's sort of like a lot of companies, 30 years ago, they started to put gyms in on location and people would go work out at lunch. But this is a similar kinds of, is there a meditation room? Is there a quiet room? Is there, what are the other spaces that people are creating that are safe for people to take time and develop that calm? I think one of the other things that people don't often talk about in corporate America is this whole idea of, workaholism. And it's sort of like, the world applauds you for those things, as opposed to if you're an alcoholic or a drug addict, these are things that have stigmas, but we look at that differently, or managers might. And so there was just an article this morning on NPR about women managers during the time of COVID, and how they have been able to develop, more sense of compassion, be able to see things from all these points of view, as a mother, as business person, as community person, as, teacher, whatever, all these roles. And I think that back to that diverse board bound topic, the more that type of diversity starts to infiltrate the leadership of all these places, we're going to have many more perspectives that can bring that compassion from all those different audiences and viewpoints. So
Maybe I can ask,
go ahead,
Carol, maybe I
Sure.
can ask one quick question, because there's
Sure.
one theme I thought that was brought up in the last discussion, and maybe I would turn Liz to you, is in the time that we find ourselves, where we do have a lot of two-dimensional interaction, and the degree of sort of face-to-face time diminishes, and that presents its own challenges. So at the same time that we have, and you mentioned the changes in the pattern of work. Mm-hmm. So at the same time that we have changes that permit us to connect with more people more readily, it's also the manner in which we connect is quite different. And I wonder if some or all the members, or some of the members of the panel, could sort of comment on mental health resilience in an age of sort of two-dimensional communications, and presumably something that will be a much more frequent part of our work lives going forward.
I would love to dig into that, to dig into that first, and then hear what the other members of the panel have to add. I'll tell you one thing that has struck me in all of these conversations about how we are working virtually and things take place on screens and who has their cameras on and who doesn't, is the ableism, the intense ableism. So I've heard people say, how am I supposed to do this? I can't see people. Well, there are lots of people who can't see people, and they do their jobs too. So to me, there's a first part here, which has to do with a tremendous amount of self-awareness about what do we understand first about who we are and how we operate and how we are resilient with our own personal experiences of setbacks. So yes, this is a different world in which we're living. We are being challenged to do things that we haven't had to do before. But many of our organizations have spaces that we're not welcoming, inviting, or inclusive of people of size, of people who are not fully able-bodied. And in some ways, this technology that we have had to go to in the time of COVID has leveled the playing field for certain folks, not everyone, and not necessarily permanently, but it has been an absolute disruptor. And one of the things that I find so interesting from a psychological perspective is the difference between interruption and disruption. So interruption means that your intent hasn't changed, your motivation hasn't changed. You have merely been interrupted as you were in the process. Disrupted, your motivation's changed, your future plan has changed, your intention has changed. This has the potential to be disruptive if we allow it to be, if we encourage it to be. It is interruptive if we take what we've done in the last 18 to 24 months and go back to business as usual. If we recognize the things that we now have an opportunity to do differently, and we let this disrupt those existing patterns, then we have ways of starting to dismantle historical inequities within the system that have challenged and minoritized and marginalized people. So I would say that as we think about how do we operate in this world where, as you said, we have gone from the 3-dimensional to the 2-dimensional, I would say that what it offers, I believe, is an opportunity to help people to further develop their emotional intelligence, first starting with their own self-awareness, then their situational awareness, their understanding of putting themselves in someone else's shoes, not just how they're coming to this, but how is the other person showing up, recognizing their environment, changing the way they self-regulate. So I think that part of this is just a tremendous opportunity, starting with leaders, because the tone has got to come from the top in many organizations, but starting with leaders in that vein, because this is a moment that has been challenging, but it offers us an opportunity to take a leap into the future that would have taken us 10, 20 years or more to get to the development that we've seen in the last 18 to 24 months, caused by a very firm application of pressure and stress.
Yes. Yeah, I like to comment. I totally agree. One of the things that I think in the talking about vocabulary, there's a question about vocabulary and vocabulary and diagnosis, I find are challenging within communities, certainly in Native community. When you have young people, it's very, young people practice in ceremonies the idea of spirit, that, living things have spirits, the tree, you don't just cut down a tree, there's all kinds of things that are not tangible. You can't reach out and grab them. And, when we have to do that with young people, so it's very easy to see that someone has, a broken foot or they hurt their hand or something like that. But how do you recognize that weak spirit, that spirit that is heading in a direction? We're not often trained to recognize that. A lot of our healers are. A lot of the traditional medicine people know, and they can see that in someone. But how can we practice that? Not that we have to be medicine people, in the traditional sense, but how do we recognize, help to understand our young people so that the terms change. So you don't have to be a sports star and have a mental health issue and then be recognized. You can be who you are. It can be something very simple, and it can be diagnosed in a way, and I don't just mean by medical profession, but by a teacher. A teacher can usually tell when something's not right, and a young person is kind of off, or maybe there's something bothering them. And I think that we don't address it at the earliest stage as we do with other diseases. And, as with disease, it takes, as long as it takes to get that disease, it may take that much longer to heal that disease. So we have to, change the way that I think we look at mental health in the very beginning, actually before we call it mental health. We have young people that, have, they have their own way of dealing with certain things. So if they're trained on, like, ceremonially in other ways, that when someone dies, they go to the spirit world, or there are things that they understand, they can accept that. It's part of the culture, it's part of their life, and so they can accept other things that I think sometimes we don't want to address it with young people for fear that they won't know how to handle it or something, but we know that they do. We know that they have the teachings and the people around them that can help them understand some of the things they're going through. And then what are the healing techniques? Who do you see and what do you say? What do you do when you're feeling a certain way, or that how can people help you? Getting to the mental health issues really early on is very important, I think. And I don't think we do that enough, or address it in a relative way. I think, well, something's wrong with Johnny. Maybe he's this, maybe he's that, but we don't realize that there's an imbalance in his spirit. There's something in his spirit that's off. And we need to heal that spirit first, and to find that out. So that's how I think of that. So.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I think I would like to sort of add to this interesting discussion is the idea of moving from 3-dimensional to 2-dimensional. I think it depends on your access first, and time, and the space. Not everyone has access to the 2-dimensional, to internet. We know that even in parts of Europe and in parts of the US, many families in rural communities, indigenous communities, in marginalized communities don't even have the facilities to access the internet and online services. So that's number one. Number two is the time. We also know that in most working class or marginalized communities, vulnerable groups, there is an issue of time poverty. You're trying to maintain a basic income and you're conducting 2 to 3 jobs, undertaking various and numerous care functions and roles. So where do you find the time? And then the thirdly is space. Are you sharing a space with multiple people? Now, I want to give you a concrete example. We had UN Globe members reaching out to me in parts of the world who could not access even the internet and had difficulties to access the very services that we had provided. We organized webinars on LGBTIQ plus mental health in the times of COVID. And one, they couldn't watch this at home because they were in a shared space with family members living in countries where being LGBTIQ plus is criminalized. They couldn't have the access because of low bandwidth. And in fact, it was the only place that they could be themselves was the office. So sometimes, we also need to be careful of, what cost does moving from 3D, or from 3-dimensional to 2-dimensional have on our people. But then having said that, again, I've been very fortunate. Last year, I was able to, meet, got a very bizarre invitation through LinkedIn for Recreate Space. And I thought, okay, what is this? Let me go along. And within half an hour, I find myself in tears thinking, why haven't I done this program before? This is amazing. And because of COVID and because of the two-dimensional, I was able to access this facility. And now, we've had hundreds of people come through our training programs that we offer for, that we create space offers for. So there are numerous opportunities here as well. So I think it's this idea, that one size fits all is not going to work. I think we have to then take it piece by piece on what works best for the people that we're aiming for as well, so that we're aiming to support. Thank you.
I don't have a ton to add. I'm not a super expert, but with my perspective from large employers, my sense is that this story is still being written completely. I agree with what Liz said about the disruptive potential, and I think those can be disruptions for good or disruptions for evil. I think one thing I'm concerned about is, and several of you mentioned it, the weakening of a social contract between organizations and their people. It's not too hard to imagine a world where everyone becomes a very distant gig worker with not getting the benefits they need and not getting all the other kinds of positive benefits of being in a community of work. So I would worry about that one. And then there are wonderful innovations too. I know many working mothers have found Zoom to be fantastic at times in terms of being able to juggle childcare and work. So I just think this is something that we need to be very cautious and thoughtful about. And it could be good and it could be bad. Quite right. Excuse me. Yes, that's true.
Thank you, Jenny. And we're going to get to your question in just a second. We'll see if Pierre has another comment on that. But I just want to thank all of you, because I think one of the things that has been a thread through all of this, and we often don't call it this, but it's also like, what is the role of privilege and what are these economic divides that exist out there? So where people don't have access to broadband, where people don't have access to technology, where they can't get on the Zoom, or they're studying for college with 3 and 4 other siblings in the same bedroom, and they're learning out of their bed. And these are some of the things that have gone on in the last year. And I think really understanding those kinds of divides as well are part of our bigger picture on this mental health piece.
Yeah, I might build on that sort of comment, a very brief comment, and perhaps a question as well, which is, I would say over the course of maybe the last decade, this sort of notion of neurodiversity and really being able to sort of open up an aperture as to what is considered normal behavior. And I guess I might pose, if anyone has a thought from their individual organizations, is there the capacity to sort of recognize a larger spectrum of behavioral patterns and activities as being normalized? And what are some of the struggles that you run into in watching in a larger organization of normalization of a breadth of behavior patterns and physiologic, ableism, and mental health sort of states? I'd love to get your thoughts about, almost from an institutional or perhaps even a personal level, how to broaden that aperture of what we consider to be, quote, normal behavior.
If I could respond, one thing that brings to mind and is how some people are very comfortable with working virtually and some aren't. And I think we've been prepped for this kind of thing in some way, because we email someone 2 doors down to see how often they can meet instead of getting up and going and talking to them and interacting with them. We limit lunch breaks. We don't allow certain things. And then maybe we'll have a social event or something. But I think we've been prepped for this kind of non-interaction with human beings. It's very unfortunate. And then along comes COVID, and some of us have put this together, put it to practice and have done very well. And others and especially from certain communities that are used to interaction and being together, like with family, like with your coworkers and things like that. I think that it's kind of separating some, and I think that we've been, I say prep, but I think that organizations, businesses, corporations have, wanted more interaction by internet and by messaging than by, personal interaction. Like I said, there were a couple of times when someone was emailing me just down the hall to find out if I was available for something several times when I said, are you in your office? Why don't I come down and we can have a chat and then we can figure out when we can meet. But I think it's a sad state sometimes that people I talk to, colleagues, are saying, I don't want to go back to the office and see people. I'm happy doing this right from home. And I think that's it is kind of a sad place sometimes that we've come to. So.
Anybody else on that same topic? Okay, if not, we do have a question from Jenny. Do you guys want to, maybe we could just look at the question Jenny Blackstone asks, which is, how can we develop a better vocabulary to talk about mental health? How can we better express the biological nature of mental health challenges, just like when we talk about diabetes or any other physical challenge?
Can I just say how much I love that question? Because
Excellent.
I appreciate that, because one of the things I've said for quite a while is I have a beautiful mind and a jerk brain. And when my prefrontal cortex is hijacked, there's not much I can do about that. It's not a character flaw. Similarly, telling someone that if they just tried a little harder, their pancreas would produce insulin properly, it's also deeply unhelpful. I think that there is so much we can do with our vocabulary, with our language, and it comes from a place of empathy. Because it's not just about teaching people, this is what you say, this is what you don't say, because that keeps them at arm's length from actually having to engage with why. It is not about the how, it is about the why. It's not how you use the language, it's why you are using that language. Is because when you don't, it's deeply unhelpful. And people are already in a spot where they don't really need anything that's not going to help them to do better. So as we think about how do we evolve the language, I think this comes back to how do we evolve empathy? How do we do that in the workplace? How do we move from recognizing language that talks about self-harm and taking one's life as if it was still a criminal act, using the word committed, as if we are still talking about self-harm in a criminalized context, attempted as if you failed at something that you should have succeeded at. No. So to me, this is a question of developing empathy and helping people to recognize that when we talk about all of this, we're talking about other human beings. We're talking about your friends, your family, yourself. And it is in that space that I believe we make the most progress. And ultimately, Ron, I think it goes back to what you started off with at the top of our discussion. It is about helping people to recognize all of the relationships they are in, and the way in which we exist is interrelated and interdependent. We are connected.
Yes.
Well said. Gurchaten, do you have some maybe closing thoughts on that?
Well, I mean,
Answer
Jenny?
Jenny.
Yeah. I mean, how do you follow that? I'm just like, yes. I couldn't agree anymore with that. I think one of the things as we do this is we have to realize that as people, there's this fallacy that we're taught from that we have stopped evolving. And we have stopped growing, and that's false. because that would assume that we're perfect. I mean, yeah, indeed we are, but in this state now we are, but I'm still not tomorrow's perfect. I'm still evolving into that. And as much as we're evolving in tomorrow's perfect, into next week's perfect of what we could be, so is our language and vocabulary. And we have to realize that the words that we're using today may be okay for today, but in a few years, in a few days, weeks, months, it may be changing. Let's look at the word that we see, taking from one spectrum to another. We've now seen that back in the 80s, it was okay to use the word handicap. Now it's not okay to use the word handicap. People living with disabilities or people living with mental health, putting the person first. We've seen in the LGBTIQ+ movement that certain words were okay then, and we thought they were okay then, but they're not okay now. And who's to say what the words that we're using today, and now we're thinking they're fine today, but in the future, as our empathy evolves, as we evolved into our perfect, that vocabulary will definitely will change, and it will continue changing, because I don't think we will ever reach that point, where we get it exactly right, because as humans we are evolving, and we're never, I think this is whole sort of fallacy that we've reached perfect evolution and that's it, we're done. Not even halfway there yet, I don't think, and if there is a halfway.
Josh?
Oh, well, just again, I just really appreciate the bravery of my panelists here. I've learned a lot from all of you, and I think we are in a deeply disruptive time. I think norms are changing so fast. There are things in the world that none of us could have imagined, and I think that's also an opportunity to reinvent vocabulary and to have leaders lead in entirely new ways. And I think we're going to have to avoid the sort of more negative directions that our world could move in this time.
Yeah, I digress for just one tiny moment and acknowledge you, Josh, because in the grand world in which we live, you and I are technically competitors. But the point that we're both here, I think, is really important, because if we get to a place where we think of each of ourselves in competition to improve equity and mental health, we have lost the plot.
Yeah.
And so I think that what is important, and what I take from this, is that it takes all of us to make progress here. And I just want to acknowledge and appreciate your coming on and joining and giving your insight, because I think it is so important that we don't fall into these silos, these myths that we've created for ourselves about what we can and cannot work together on. We're human beings trying to be better at being human.
Thank you, Liz.
Thank you, Liz. Very, very well said. And Pierre, do you want to wrap it up, and then I'll make a couple remarks before we close out?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I've just been taking some notes here as you've been speaking, and there's been some very important themes here around relationship and stigma and the types of support that we like to see in the workplace and beyond. And I think the point that Liz finished on, which is a sense of collaboration, is absolutely critical. Many of these drivers of healthcare outcomes are what you might call upstream drivers. They are structural. And that is exactly where organizations and disparate organizations can collaborate to have long-term impact. So I am very grateful to all the panel's speakers today and the remarkable input that you provided. And Ron, we note the incredible challenge of being a Sundancer. So thank you for sharing that with us right off the bat.
Thank
and
you.
To all of you, I really appreciate your insights today. And I hope for all those that are listening, you'll feel comfortable in reaching out to send us emails that are necessary. We all would be happy to answer questions to the best of our ability. And thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Pierre. And I'll just say one other save the date for all of you is November 3rd. We'll have our 2021 Inclusive Leader Awards. And we call those the DEI Awards of, the Academy Awards of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. So it's across 15 different sectors. And in June, when we're live at the conference, we'll have the 2022 winners. So we'd like to invite all of you to be part of our VIP attendance for that event. It'll be less than an hour. But really amazing people. And I think you'll be very inspired to see leaders who we hope will be household names as much as sports stars are and movie stars, because we don't believe we can see the diversity that we want to see until these people are household names. And then the last thing I'll say is I think you all are such a powerful thought leadership team. And I hope that on the mental health and wellness, we can kind of continue to grow these different perspectives, have you all work more with each other and have us all be together maybe for a pre-conference on this topic in June, because it's critical. And I think we could have some really wonderful students involved and some other folks from education. And I look forward to doing that. I think you guys are really an amazing group of perspectives on such an important topic. So thanks to everybody for spending time with us today. And we will be sending you all the link to this so you can share it with your different networks. And then we'll also be sharing the VIP invite for November 3rd. And anybody who wants to join us tomorrow at the same time for the Diverse Board Bound series, we'd love to have you or anybody in your network for that. So thanks, and we will see you next time. Take good care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.